How can a country built on freedom continue to enslave 4 million people? The Founding Fathers knew long ago that this day would come. Thomas Jefferson himself had condemned slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but was forced to delete it for fear of losing the support of the South. They put off the problems, hoping that their descendants could solve the problems they couldn't. But now, as the country expands westward, this reckoning has arrived with thunderous force. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 seemed to be a solution at that time. Missouri will enter the United States as a slave state, and Maine as a free state, drawing a dividing line across the continental United States at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Everything above is free, while everything below is enslavement. Henry Clay, the great compromising man, meticulously planned this delicate dance, believing that he had once and for all resolved the issue of slavery. He was completely wrong. However, while politicians are cheering for their smart solutions, the economic and cultural gap between the North and the South is widening like a chasm. The North is rapidly industrializing. Cities are crowded with immigrants from Ireland and Germany, and factories are brimming with the hope of progress. The South remained agricultural, and its economy was built on the backs of slaves who worked in vast plantations under the scorching sun. Cotton is the king, and slavery is its crown. The invention of the cotton blint in 1793 changed the economy of the South overnight. In the past, separating cotton fibers from cotton seeds was a labor-intensive process, but now it can be accomplished mechanically, which makes cotton production highly profitable. But this technological progress has also come at a terrifying price. It made slavery more entrenched, more valuable and more secure than ever before. Southerners euphemistically refer to it as a special system. It is no longer merely a social system, but the foundation of their entire way of life. In the North, a different revolution is taking place. The Second Great Awakening swept across the entire region like wildfire, bringing about a renewed emphasis on moral reform and social justice. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison published fierce newspapers, condemning slavery as a sin to God and humanity. The Underground Railroad, a secret network composed of safe houses and brave commanders, helped thousands of slaves escape to the North and Canada to gain their freedom. However, even among Northerners, attitudes towards slavery were complex and often contradictory. Many people opposed slavery not out of concern for African Americans, but because they were worried that slave labor would reduce the wages of white workers. Others were worried that the expansion of slavery would concentrate too much political power in the hands of Southern plantation owners. Although moral arguments against slavery have grown increasingly strong, they remain just one voice among the noises of economic and political concerns. In the Congress Hall, this tense atmosphere was obvious. Representatives from both the North and the South were looking at each other with increasing suspicion. Every new territory applying for nation-building has the potential to disrupt this delicate balance. Every debate over tariffs or internal improvements has turned into a proxy war between different visions for the future of the United States. Thoughtful observers from both the North and the South began to doubt whether the Union could survive. In the slave areas of the Southern plantations, 4 million African Americans lived in slavery. Their lives were controlled by their masters, who could buy, sell, whip or kill them at will without punishment. Families were torn up at auctions, children were sold from their parents, and husbands and wives were separated. The psychological trauma brought by slavery was as devastating as its physical brutality. However, even in the abyss of oppression, the enslaved people still maintained their humanity, their culture and their hope for freedom. They sang hymns of liberation, told stories of preserving their traditions, and never ceased to believe that one day they would be free in some way. The free blacks in the North were facing their own challenges. Although they are legally free, they are discriminated against everywhere. Most states have deprived them of the right to vote, to serve as jurors, or to attend public schools. They were banned from many occupations and forced to live in segregated communities. However, they persevered, built churches, schools and enterprises, and became one of the most persuasive voices in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass was born into a slave family, but was self-reliant and highly talented, becoming one of the most influential orators of his generation. His speeches and writings exposed the terror of slavery to audiences in Northern Europe and Europe. With the arrival of the 1842s, the problem of the expansion of slavery became increasingly urgent. The Mexican-American War added vast new territories to the United States, and the question of whether these lands were slaves or free could no longer be evaded. The Lulmont Proviso, which prohibited slavery in all the territories obtained from Mexico, was passed in the House of Representatives, but rejected in the Senate. The battle lines are being drawn and compromise is becoming increasingly difficult. The Compromise of 1850 was Henry Clay's last great attempt to maintain the unity of the Union. California will join as a free state. The territories of Utah and New Mexico would decide the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty on their own. In Washington, D.C., the slave trade would be abolished and a more powerful Fugitive Slave Act would require an ordinance to help capture and repatriate fugitive slaves. This is a complex plan. Both sides are satisfied, but neither is satisfied. The Fugitive Slave Act was particularly inflammatory in the North. Suddenly, free African Americans could be caught on the street and dragged back to slavery with minimal legal protection. Northern whites who were previously indifferent to slavery found themselves forced to participate in its enforcement, or else they would face criminal charges. This law turned every Northern community into a potential battlefield between slave hunters and abolitionists. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, brought the reality of slavery into the Northern living room with an unprecedented emotional power. This book sold over 300,000 copies in its first year of publication and was adapted into stages across North Korea. People in the South condemn this as propagandium lies, but its influence on public opinion in the North is undeniable. Many years later, when Stowe met President Lincoln, it was said that he told her, "You are the little woman who wrote a book that sparked this great war." The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1850 crushed the Missouri Compromise and opened the floodgates of violence. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was eager to build a transcontinental railway running through his state. He proposed organizing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska based on the principle of popular sovereignty. This meant that the issue of slavery would be decided by the sectors themselves, effectively abolishing the rule in the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery north of line 3,630. People reacted quickly and angrily. Northern politicians condemned this act as a betrayal of the sacred compromise. Southern politicians regarded this as an opportunity to extend slavery to new territories. But in Kansas, the consequences will be most significant. Pro-minus slavery immigrants from Missouri, known as border rioters, flooded into the border to vote in territorial elections. Many anti-minus slavery settlers sponsored by the Northern Immigrant Aid Society established their own communities, ready to fight for the soul of Kansas. The result was a bloody Kansas, foreshadowing an even greater conflict on the horizon. The election was undermined by fraud and violence. Two hostile governments claimed its legitimacy. Armed gangs roamed around the area, burning houses and murdering opponents. In May 1856, the pro-minus slavery army ransacked the town of Lawrence, a free state, destroyed the printing press, burned down buildings, and violent activities reached their peak. 3 days later, a radical abolitionist named John Brown attacked pro-minus slavery settlers in Port Ava Tammy Creek at midnight. Brown and his followers dragged 5 people out of their home and killed them with broadswords. As is well known, the Port Ava Tammy massacre sent shockwaves across the country and made Brown one of the most controversial figures of his time. To the abolitionists, he was a just warrior against the evil of slavery. To people in the South, he was a terrorist and a lunatic. The violent incidents in Kansas reflect the increasingly tense situation in Washington. In 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered a fierce speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he personally attacked several Southern senators. Among them was Andrew Butler from South Carolina. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber and knocked Sumner unconscious with a golden miner's-headed cane. Sumner's injuries were so severe that he was unable to return to the Senate for more than 3 years, but Massachusetts left his seat vacant, but a symbol of the brutality of the South. The summit of Suma Island became the battle cry of both sides. Northerners consider this an attack on freedom of speech and the democratic system, and they are shocked by it. Southerners praised Brooks as a defender of Southern honor and gave him dozens of walking sticks. This incident perfectly reflects the collapse of civic discourse and the increasing resort of violence in American politics. In 1857, the Supreme Court's ruling in the Scott case dealt another devastating blow to the anti-slavery cause. Chief Justice Roger Tenway, on behalf of the majority, declared that African Americans could never become U.S. citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in these territories. The Missouri Compromise was declared unconstitutional, and the federal government was prohibited from interfering in slavery anywhere in the country. This decision was a legal and political earthquake. Republicans condemned this as a conspiracy to nationalize slavery. When the court declared that local legislative bodies had no right to exclude slavery, Stephen Douglas found himself in an impossible position to defend the sovereignty of the people. Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown lawyer and politician from Illinois, began to become a powerful voice opposing this decision and its impact. In 1858, when Lincoln accepted the nomination of the Republican Senate, he delivered the famous House split speech, clarifying his belief that the issue of slavery could no longer be compromised. Lincoln declared that a divided family could not survive. "I believe this government cannot tolerate a state of half-slavery and half-freedom forever. I don't think the trade union will be dissolved, but I do hope it won't split anymore. It will turn into one thing or another." Subsequently, during the 1858 Senate campaign, the debate between Lincoln and Douglas drew national attention to the two individuals and helped to turn on the terms of the slavery debate. Douglas defended popular sovereignty and attempted to portray Lincoln as a radical abolitionist. Lincoln carefully distinguished his personal opposition to slavery from his constitutional obligations, but he made it clear that he believed slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to expand. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debate made him a nationally renowned figure and a major spokesperson for the Republican Party. His cautious and rational arguments against the expansion of slavery, coupled with his obvious political skills, made him an attractive candidate for senior positions. The election of 1860 had already begun. This election not only determined who would become the president, but also whether the Union could survive. In the autumn of 1859, an event occurred that would push this country down a path of no return. John Brown, the one who masterminded the Powhatan massacre in Kansas, orchestrated an even more ambitious and perilous undertaking in the following years. He envisioned a slave uprising that would spread like wildfire to the South, liberating millions of enslaved people and submitting this particular system. Brown's plan was simple and bold, but its meaning was terrifying. He will seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, arm the local slaves, and establish a stronghold in the Blue Ridge Mountains, from where he can launch attacks throughout the South. This was part of the Southern nightmare, and its consequences far exceeded Brown's imagination. On the evening of October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 followers, including 5 black men and his own, crossed the Tuaque River and seized the armory. They cut off the telegraph line, took several local celebrities hostage and waited for the enslaved people to flock to their flag. But the uprising that Brown had expected did not materialize. On the contrary, local militia surrounded the armory, and the federal troops commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived, ending the deadlock. The cabin where Brown and his men were hiding was attacked quickly and resolutely. 10 of Brown's followers were killed, including his 2 sons. Brown himself was also injured and captured along with several others. This raid lasted less than 36 hours, but its impact will reverberate in the coming years. Brown's trial caused a nationwide sensation. Lying on the simple bed in the courtroom, though injured, he remained unyielding. He transformed himself from a failed rebel into a martyr of the abolitionist cause. His final speech in court was a masterpiece of moral belief. "If I deem it necessary, I should sacrifice my life for the purpose of promoting justice and fair than mix my blood with that of my children and the blood of millions of people in this slave state, whose rights have been ignored by evil, cruel and unjust laws, and I submit. So, just let it do it. The response to Brown's raid execution revealed the depth of the gap between the North and the South. In the North, on the day he was executed, the church bells rang, and he was hailed as a martyr who sacrificed his life for the cause of human freedom. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Jesus Christ, and Henry David Thoreau called him the angel of light. In the South, Brown was regarded as the embodiment of Northern fanaticism, proving that abolitionists would do whatever it takes to destroy Southern society. This raid also had another significant impact. It convinced many Southerners that they could no longer trust that the federal government would protect their interests. What would happen if a few abolitionists were able to seize the federal arsenal and attempt to incite a slave rebellion? And if the pro-minus slavery Republicans took control of the government? Many people in the South believed that the answer is to destroy their way of life. With the arrival of 1860, the Democratic Party, which had united the Union through decades of compromise, began to split along factional lines. The Democratic National Convention held in Charleston, South Carolina, became a battlefield between the Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas and the Southern Democrats demanding federal protection of slavery in these territories. When the convention failed to nominate Douglas, representatives from the South left, and the Republican Party split into two camps, the North and the South. Meanwhile, the Republican Party is gaining strength and confidence. It was founded 6 years ago as an anti-slavery party. By attracting Northern voters who were opposed to the expansion of slavery, the party grew rapidly. The party's election platform in 1860 was carefully designed to attract a wide range of coalitions. Oppose the expansion of slavery, support transcontinental railways, raise tariffs to protect Northern industries, and provide free land for settlers in the West. At the Republican National Convention held in Chicago, several candidates were vying for the presidential nomination. William Say out of New York was an early favorite, but his radical reputation on the issue of slavery made him vulnerable. Abraham Lincoln, a prairie lawyer from Illinois, emerged as a compromising candidate who could attract moderate voters while maintaining the Republican Party's anti-slavery principles. Lincoln's nomination caused a huge stir in the South. This was a man who claimed that the Federation could not tolerate half slavery and half freedom. He had debated with Stephen Douglas about the immorality of slavery. He represented a party committed to ultimately eliminating slavery. Southern newspapers condemned him as a black Republican who would undermine the civilization of the South. Even before the election, several Southern states began to prepare for secession from the Union. The general election of 1860 was unlike any other in American history, for candidates are competing for the presidency. Lincoln represented the Republican Party, Douglas represented the Northern Democratic Party, John Brinich represented the Southern Democratic Party, and John Bell represented the Constitutional League Party. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballots of the 10 Southern states, which clearly shows how divided the country has become. Lincoln held the traditional front porch campaign at his home in Springfield, Illinois, receiving visitors, while his supporters organized torch parades and mass rallies across the North. He spoke very little during the campaign, allowing his previous speeches and the Republican Party's platform to speak for him. His silence was strategic. Whatever he says will be distorted by his opponents, making him seem more radical than he actually is. The outcome of the election is decisive, but also ominous. Lincoln won a clear majority of 180 votes in the Electoral College, but he received less than 40% of the popular votes and received almost no support in the South. This election has revealed a country so divided that no candidate can appeal to both groups at the same time. If the center is not firmly established, the consequences will be disastrous. South Carolina has been preparing for this moment for months. Even before the election results were officially announced, the state legislature called for a secession convention. On December 20, 1860, the delegates meeting in Charleston unanimously voted to sever the ties between South Carolina and the United States. The Palm State fired the first shot of the war, which brought unprecedented destruction. After South Carolina seceded from the Union, a series of similar actions also took place in the Deep South. Mississippi seceded from the Union on January 9, 1861, followed closely by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1st, 7 states had seceded from the Union. Representatives gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation. The Confederate States of America Conference promptly established a government. They adopted a constitution mainly based on the United States Constitution, but there were significant differences. It explicitly protected slavery, limited the presidential term to 6 years, and granted greater rights to the states. Jefferson Davis, a graduate of West Point and a former U.S. Senator, was elected president of Mississippi, and Alexander Stephens of Georgia was elected vice president. In his inaugural address, Stephens clarified the position of the Confederation. He claimed that the cornerstone of this new country was built on a great truth, namely that inequality between blacks and whites, slavery, and subordination to higher races were his natural and normal state. Nothing can more clearly explain the cause of the Confederation, nor can anything more clearly explain the fundamental problems that lead to the division of this country. Meanwhile, in Washington, James Buchanan's lame duck government is struggling to deal with this crisis. Buchanan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, sympathized with the South. He declared secession from the Union illegal, but claimed that the federal government had no power to stop it. Due to his inaction, the Confederate States of the South was able to seize federal properties throughout the South, including fortresses, ammunition depots, and customs. Abraham Lincoln, still the elected president, watched the development of these events and became increasingly alarmed. He hoped his election would not lead to division, and he still believed that the majority of Southerners were loyal to the Union. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he attempted to placate the South while clearly expressing his determination to uphold the Union. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere in the systems of states with slavery," Lincoln declared. "I don't think I have the legal right to do so, nor do I have the will to do so." But he also made it clear that he would not admit secession from the Union. No state can legally secede from the Union by its own motion. The Federation is permanent and it will use all its constitutional powers to uphold it. The South turned a deaf ear to Lincoln's words. The Confederacy of the South had gone beyond the point where the president guaranteed to bring them back to the Union. They established their own government, elected their own president, and were determined to build their own independence. The only question now is whether this can be accomplished peacefully or through war. The answer comes from a small fortress in Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter, built on an artificial island to defend the port, has become a symbol of federal authority in the center of the Southern Confederation. Last December, Major Robert Anderson, the commander of the fort, moved a small portion of his garrison from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie here, angering the people of South Carolina, who regarded it as an act of aggression. The situation of the fortress is precarious. When the Confederate forces surrounded the port, Anderson had less than 80 troops and limited supplies. Lincoln was faced with a dilemma: resupply the fortress either at the risk of war or by giving it up, showing an attitude of acknowledging the independence of the Confederation. He chose a middle route and announced that he would deliver supplies to the fortress but would not provide reinforcements. The leaders of the Confederate States regarded this as a crucial moment for them. If they allow the federal troops to remain in the port of Charleston, their claim for independence will be meaningless. On April 11th, Confederate General Bogard demanded that Anderson surrender. When Anderson refused, Bogard ordered his gun to fire. At 4:30 am on April 12, 1861, a Confederate mortar shell streaked through the darkness and exploded over Fort Sumter. The American Civil War began. For as long as 34 hours, the Confederate artillery fire kept bombarding the fortress, while Anderson's troops did their best to fight back. Miraculously, no one died in the bombing, but there was no hope for the situation of the fortress. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered, marking the first time since the American War of Independence that the Stars and Stripes were lowered at Fort Sumter. The attack on Fort Sumter shocked the North. Lincoln immediately summoned 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. People flocked into the army, and the number was so large that even the most optimistic officials were surprised. The war that many people hope to avoid is now inevitable, that both sides are preparing for what they consider a brief but decisive conflict. But there was another consequence of the attack on Sunbutte. For more states joined the Confederation. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee and Arkansas initially all refused to secede from the Union. But Lincoln asked the army to protect the sister states, which was beyond their capacity to bear. By June, 11 states had joined the Confederation and the battle lines had been drawn. The war that began at Fort Sumter lasted for 4 years and claimed the lives of more than 600,000 people. It would transform the United States from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation, ending slavery forever and establishing supreme power of the federal government over the states. But in April 1861, all of this was unforeseeable. Americans on both sides believe that they are fighting for their most sacred principles and are prepared to pay any price for victory. In the spring of 1861, the United States transformed overnight from a peaceful country into one ready for war. In the North, the attack on Sam put kindled a patriotic enthusiasm that had never been seen since the Revolution. Young people are queuing up at the recruitment station. The band played martial music in the town square, and women organized a sewing circle to make uniforms for the volunteers. The cause of the Federation seems just and victory is inevitable. But beneath the surface of enthusiasm lies an unsettling reality. The number of the U.S. military was less than 16,000, and most of them were scattered along the western border to fight against the Indians. The Navy was very small and many of its officers were Southerners who had resigned from their military positions. The government has no plans for large minor-scale wars, no system for forming large minor-scale armies, and no experience in handling the upcoming large minor-scale conflicts. Abraham Lincoln was pushed to the presidency during the most serious crisis in American history, but he never commanded a company of soldiers. His military experience included a brief service in the Black Hawk Wars 30 years ago, during which he did not take part in any battles. Later, he joked that his only fight was against mosquitoes. However, this grassland lawyer must learn the art of war while commanding it and make life and death decisions that affect millions of people. The first challenge the president faced was to control the federal border states. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri and Delaware all have large kinship populations, and their losses would be disastrous. The secession of Maryland would surround Washington, D.C. with enemy territory. Kentucky controls most of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Missouri is the gateway to the West. Lincoln had to comprehensively employ political skills, military strength and constitutional flexibility to maintain the loyalty of these states. In Maryland, pro-Ines Confederate rioters attacked federal troops passing through Baltimore on their way to Washington. In response, Lincoln suspended the habeas corpus and arrested separatist suspects, including members of the state legislature. Lincoln ignored Chief Justice Roger Taney when he ruled that only Congress could suspend the customary protection order. Lincoln believed that the Constitution was not a suicide pact and that extraordinary measures were needed in extraordinary times. Kentucky has raised different challenges. The state declared neutrality, hoping to completely avoid war. At first, both the Federal and Confederate armies respected this neutral attitude, but this attitude could not last. In September 1861, the Confederate Army occupied Columbus, Kentucky. Union General Grant immediately occupied Paducah and Cairo. The fortunate neutrality came to an end, and the state remained in the Union, although its thousands of sons would fight for the Confederacy. Missouri was plunged into a vicious civil war within the Civil War. Nathaniel Leen, the governor who supported the United Nations, clashed with the state militia that supported the Confederation, leading to battles in Wilson Creek and Lexington. Guerrilla warfare broke out throughout the state. The jungle hunters of the Southern Union and the Indians of the Northern Union intimidated civilians and burned down towns. The violent incidents in Missouri continued throughout the war and even after it ended, causing lasting wounds that would take generations to heal. While Lincoln was striving to maintain the unity of the Union, Jefferson Davis also faced challenges in Richmond, the new capital of the Confederation. The Confederate States was born in haste and its government was still in the formative stage. Davis, who graduated from West Point and served as the United States Secretary of War, brought his military experience to the presidency. But he also brought about an irritable personality and a tendency toward micromanagement, which would cause problems throughout the war. The Confederate Constitution granted each state more powers than the United States Constitution, reflecting the South's belief in the rights of each state. However, such decentralization of power is problematic during wartime, as rapid decision-making and unified action are indispensable in such times. Georgia Governor Joseph Brown will argue with Davis over conscription and other federal policies for most of the war. The governor of South Carolina refused to allow his state army to serve outside South Carolina. The Union's commitment to the rights of each state would weaken its ability to wage war effectively. Both sides are confronted with the huge challenge of building an army from scratch. The Federation has significant advantages in terms of population, industry and resources, but they must be mobilized and organized. The 22 million population of North Korea dwarfs the 9 million people in the South, among whom nearly 4 million are slaves and unable to be armed. Factories in the North could produce weapons, uniforms and equipment, while those in the South had to rely on imports or seize supplies from the Federation. The railway network also tells a similar story. There are over 20,000 miles of railways connecting its cities in the North, facilitating the movement of troops and supplies. There are only 9,000 miles of railways in the South, most of which are in poor condition and use different gauges, hindering traffic. Facts have proved that North Korea's railway system is crucial to its victory, as it enables the rapid mobilization of troops and the maintenance of supplies in distant places. But the South also has its advantages. This was a defensive battle fought on familiar territory, with shorter supply lines and less support from local residents. Men in the South have a strong military tradition and are very experienced with horses and firearms. Many of the most outstanding officers in the Army, including Robert T. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston and Joseph E. Johnston, had resigned from their positions and joined the Confederacy. The first major battle of this war came earlier than anyone had expected. Public pressure from the North called for action, and newspapers shouted loudly, "Go to Richmond." Lincoln's commander, Winfield Scott, tended to adopt a slow strategy of blocking the southern ports and controlling the Mississippi River, but political pressure forced him to authorize the advance towards the Confederate capital. General Lowen McDowell led 35,000 Union troops southward from Washington towards the Confederate forces near the Manassas confluence in Virginia. General Buffett's Confederate army numbered approximately 20,000, but they were looking forward to the reinforcements from the Shannon to a valley led by General Joseph E. Johnston. The first major battle of the Civil War was all set. On July 21, 1861, these two armies clashed near Boar Creek, which was known as the First Battle of Boar Creek or the First Battle of Manassas of the Confederate States. Civilians from Washington, including members of Congress and their families, rode in carriages to watch the battle, hoping to see the Union Army win quickly and end the rebellion. For the Federation, this battle started smoothly, caught the Confederate forces off guard. Within a few hours it seemed that the Confederate forces were about to win, but the Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail. A Virginia brigade led by Colonel Thomas J. Jackson withstood the Confederate forces' repeated attacks. General Barnard B. shouted. Jackson stood there like a stone wall and was given a nickname, which later made him famous. As time went by, the situation began to turn against the Federation. The newly joined Confederate Army launched a counterattack and broke through the Union's defense line. The originally orderly retreat soon turned into a panicked rout for Union soldiers to rush towards Washington. Civilians who came to watch the battle found themselves trapped in the retreating troops. Their carriages blocked the roads, exacerbating the chaos. The defeat at the Battle of Berna was a thought-provoking blow to the North. The war will not end within 90 days as many people predict. The Confederate Army was not a motley crew but a powerful combat force. Lincoln realized that he needed a larger army, better generals and a long-term strategy to win the war. The president turned to General George B. Miller for help, a young officer who had fought some minor battles in West Virginia. Miller was an outstanding organizer and trainer of the military. He soon began to turn a group of volunteers around Washington into a real army. He trained them ruthlessly, improved their equipment and supplies, and instilled discipline and pride in them. This army, known as PTAAC, will become one of the most outstanding combat units in American history. But Miller has a fatal flaw. He is overly cautious and often overestimates the strength of his enemies. He believed that the number of the Allied forces he was facing was twice the actual number, so he was reluctant to attack unless he had an overwhelming advantage. Such caution would have defeated Lincoln and prolonged the war. But it also enabled the Federation to avoid a potentially catastrophic failure in the early stage of the conflict. When Mullen was training his army, the war expanded to other war zones. In the West, the Union Army led by General Nathaniel Lyon was defeated at Wilson Creek in Missouri, and Lyon was killed in battle. Confederate forces invaded Kentucky, threatening to draw this crucial state into a rebellion. When the Federation attempted to blockade the southern ports, a naval battle broke out along the coast. The blockade was part of General Scott's Python Plan, aiming to economically strangle the Confederacy by cutting off trade with Europe. The South relied on cotton exports to fund the war and needed to import weapons, ammunition and other materials. If the Federation could blockade the southern ports, it could gradually eliminate the rebels. But the blockade is facing huge challenges. The southern coastline stretches for 3,500 meters and includes dozens of ports and entrances. At the beginning of the war, the Union Navy had only 42 active vessels, many of which were outdated sailing ships. Establishing an effective blockade requires a large scale expansion of the Navy and the development of new technologies. The first major victory took place in Hatteras Bay, North Carolina. In August 1861, a joint Army and Navy expedition captured the Confederate fortresses. This victory gave the Union a foothold on the southern coast. The effectiveness of joint operations. Similar expeditions followed one after another, gradually tightening the constraints on the Southern Confederations. As both sides are seeking foreign recognition and support, this war has also had an international impact. The Confederacy of the South hoped that Europe's reliance on Southern cotton would force Britain and France to intervene on its behalf. The Federation made efforts to prevent foreign recognition of the Confederation and maintain the neutrality of the European powers. This crisis reached its peak in the Trent incident in November 1861. A federal warship intercepted the British men's ship Trent and took away two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John S. Eliot Elm, who were on their way to Europe seeking recognition from the Confederation of that time. The British government was outraged by this violation of the right to neutrality and demanded the release of diplomats and an apology. For several weeks, a war between the United States and Britain seemed likely to break out. Patton sent troops to Kennedy and prepared a fleet. But the calm ones got the upper hand. The Lincoln administration agreed to release the diplomats and apologize for the incident. It is reported that Lincoln said, "Fight one war at a time." He realized that the Union could not fight both the Confederate States and the British Empire simultaneously. The year 1861 was coming to an end, and both sides were ready to face a long bloody conflict. The initial passion for war has given way to a resolute determination to carry it through to the end. Every household is already mourning the deceased, and the economic losses caused by the war are also increasing. But now there is no turning back. The die has been cast, and the fate of the country will be determined on the battlefield in the coming years. The winter of 1861 to 1862 was a period of preparation and planning. Both armies used the intervals between battles to train new recruits, gather supplies and plan the next move. In Washington, Lincoln struggled to cope with the huge burden of wartime leadership, dealing with demanding generals, cut-minus-tempered politicians and the public who hoped for quick results. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced similar challenges due to the weak central government of the Confederation and the need to establish a nation during the war. The War of 1862 had already begun, and both its scope and intensity were expanding. New technologies will be tested, new strategies will be attempted, and new heroes will emerge. The American Civil War is about to enter its bloodiest stage, and this country will never be the same as before. After months of preparation and training, at dawn in 1862, both armies were ready to act. The Union Army took advantage of this winter to form an army and formulated a comprehensive victory strategy. Meanwhile, the Confederate States has strengthened its defense and is preparing for a life minus death struggle known to its leaders. In the Western Theater, a relatively unknown Union general, Ulysses Grant, is about to leave his mark in history. After graduating from West Point Military Academy, Grant struggled in civilian life and failed in both agriculture and business until the war saved him from obscurity. But the qualities he possessed made him one of the greatest military commanders in American history. Determination, strategic vision, and the understanding that war is ultimately aimed at destroying the enemies will to fight. In February 1862, Grant achieved his first major victory at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The location of this fortress was very poor and it soon fell into the hands of Federal gunboats, thus opening up the navigation passage of the Tennessee River. More importantly, this gave Grant the opportunity to attack Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which controlled the passage to Nashville, the capital of Tennessee. The siege of Fort Donelson became Grant's first real test as a commander. The Confederate defenders, led by Simon Bolivar Barkenea, an old friend of Grant at West Point, were in trouble and faced an inevitable defeat. When Barkenea put forward the conditions, Grant's response became legendary. No conditions can be accepted unless one surrenders unconditionally and immediately. I suggest you start your work immediately. The fall of Fort Donelson was a devastating blow to the Confederations of the South, and the Confederate forces were forced to retreat within Tennessee. Grant became a national hero overnight and was given the nickname Grant who surrendered unconditionally. More importantly, this victory paved the way for the Union Army to penetrate deep into the heartland of the Confederate States. But Grant's greatest test has yet to come. In April 1862, the Confederate forces led by Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's troops near a small chapel called Shiloh, where they landed in Pittsburgh, Tennessee. This attack caught the Union Army completely off guard. For a moment, it seemed that the Confederate Army might win a decisive victory. The Battle of Shiloh was something that Americans had never experienced before. The battle was brutal and chaotic. The troops got lost in the thick woods and wrongly attacked their own men. General Johnston was one of the most promising commanders of the Confederate States. He was killed in the early stage of the battle due to excessive blood loss from a leg injury. Had he received proper medical treatment, he might have survived. Grant's army was forced to retreat to the Tennessee River. Many of his subordinates urged him to retreat, but Grant refused to give up. It is reported that he said, "No, I'm planning to attack them at dawn and flog them." With the reinforcement of General Don Carlos Bull's army, General Grant launched a counterattack the next morning and drove the Confederate army out of the battlefield. The casualties in Shiloh were heavy. The Northern Army suffered more than 13,000 casualties and the Southern Army nearly 11,000. This was the bloodiest battle in American history to date, and it showed both sides the impending massacre. Some people criticized Grant for coming by surprise, but Lincoln defended him. "I can't let this person go. He fights." When Grant won in the West, the situation in the East still frustrated the Union. General M. Len spent several months training and organizing the PTIC army, but it seems that he is reluctant to use it. Lincoln became increasingly impatient with Mullen's delays and excuses. He once wrote a famous saying, "If General Mullen does not want to use the army, I am willing to borrow it temporarily." Finally, in March 1862, Mullen launched his Peninsula Campaign, transporting his troops by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and advancing from the southeast towards Richmond. This plan was reasonable in theory, but due to his consistent excessive caution and tendency to overestimate the enemy's strength, there were flaws in Mullen's execution. The Battle of the Peninsula began with great promise. The Union forces advanced into the line of sight of the Richmond church spire, but Mullen hesitated whether to launch a final strike. He was convinced that he was at a numerical disadvantage and that the Southern army was actually smaller than him. This hesitation gave the Confederate States time to organize its defense and bring in reinforcements. The Confederacy's defense in Richmond became more complicated due to the change of the commander. General Joseph E. Johnston, who led the Confederate forces on the peninsula, was wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines at the end of May. Jefferson Davis replaced him with Robert E. Lee, and this decision will prove to be one of the most important decisions in the war. General Lee was 55 years old at that time. Most of his career had been spent as an engineer and a staff officer. He opposed secession from the Union and was appointed commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, but his loyalty to Virginia led him to resign from his position in the U.S. Army and join the Confederate States. Many people questioned Davis' choice because General Lee's previous command in West Virginia and South Carolina was not outstanding. But General Lee was later proved to be a military genius and perhaps the most outstanding tactical commander in American history. He understood that the Confederate States could not defeat the more populous and more industrialized North in a war of attrition. On the contrary, he will have to take risks, employed old tactics and hope to win a decisive victory, thereby dampening the morale of the North and inviting for an intervention. General Lee's first major operation was a series of attacks on Miller's army in late June 1862. This battle was costly for both sides, but Lee achieved his strategic goal and forced Miller to retreat from Richmond. In the Battle of the Peninsula, the Federation made so many promises but ended up in failure. Maylands' retreat greatly disappointed Lincoln and the people of the North. This general, hailed as the young Napoleon, despite having all the advantages, failed to capture Richmond. Lincoln began to lose faith in Melanie. Although he would give him another chance to prove himself, the defeat in the Battle of the Peninsula had a broader impact on the Federation's strategy. It is obvious that this war will not be won quickly or easily. The Federation needs to mobilize all resources for a long-term struggle. Congress passed the first conscription bill in American history. Although it allows the rich to hire substitutes or pay a $300 commutation fee, this has led people to complain that it is a war between the rich and a battle between the poor. War also began to fundamentally change American society. The demands of conflict have broken down traditional barriers and created new opportunities for previously marginalized groups. Women began to play new roles, such as nurses, factory workers, and even spies. The renowned nurse Clara Barton later founded the American Red Cross based on her experiences during the Civil War. African Americans, whether free or enslaved, all regarded this war as an opportunity to fight for freedom. Thousands upon thousands of slaves fled to the Union front, where they were listed as contraband and sent to support the war. The free blacks in the North requested the right to serve in the army, although they were not allowed to do so until the later stage of the war. The issue of slavery has increasingly become the core problem of war. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for the liberation of slaves, believing that slavery was the root cause of rebellion and that it must be eradicated to ensure lasting peace. Lincoln was more cautious. He was worried that taking action against slavery too early would push the border states towards the Confederacy and alienate the conservative Northern Democrats. But the situation forced Lincoln to take action. The war lasted longer and cost more than anyone had expected. If the EU demands such a huge sacrifice from its citizens, it needs a more inspiring reason than simply maintaining the status quo. The liberation of slaves would give the war moral significance, thereby rallying the support of the North and preventing Europe from intervening on behalf of the Confederation. The military situation also supported the liberation of black slaves. Slaves were an important resource of the Confederacy, while whites fought in the army. If the federal government could make use of this resource and promise freedom to the enslaved people, It would deal a devastating blow to the efforts of the Southern War. Lincoln began drafting Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862, but his advisers persuaded him to wait until after military victory to announce it. Announcements made after defeat seem like desperate acts, while those made after victory appear to be of great strength. The opportunity came earlier than expected. Because of the victory at Richmond, General Lee decided to wage war to the north. In September 1862, he led his army across the PTA's River into Maryland, hoping to achieve a decisive victory on the northern land, thereby gaining recognition in Europe and perhaps ending the war. General Lee's invasion of Maryland was a carefully planned gamble. His army was exhausted and undersupplied. Many of his soldiers were barefoot and in tattered clothes. However, General Lee believed that the victory in Maryland might change the course of the entire war. The European powers were closely watching. The victory of the confederations of the South on the northern lands might persuade them to recognize the independence of the South. Lee's campaign got off to a good start. His army entered Maryland without encountering resistance, and he issued a declaration calling on Marylanders to join the cause of the Confederation. But General Lee's plan ran into trouble because a copy of his order was discovered by a Union soldier, wrapped in 3 cigars and left in an abandoned Union camp. The lost order indicates that General Lee has split his army, sending some to capture the Federal defenders at Harper's Ferry, while the rest continued to advance northward. For the first time, Millen acted promptly, using this intelligence to advance and attack Lee's separatist forces. On September 17, 1862, the two armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. The battle was brutal and chaotic, with both sides launching desperate attacks and counterattacks in the undulating countryside of Maryland. The battle began at dawn when the Union forces launched an attack on the left flank of the Confederate forces near Bunker Church. The battle was fought back and forth in the cornfield, and several regiments were annihilated within minutes. The first batch of Texas infantry entered the battlefield with 226 men, but in the end, only 40 remained. The corn was cut down by a huge sickle, and corpses were everywhere in the field. At the center of the Confederacy front was a sunken road. After the Union Army finally broke through and filled the corpses of the Confederacy, this road was called Bloody Lane. The right wing of the Confederate forces anchored at Antietam Creek, where a narrow stone bridge became the focus of repeated attacks by the Union forces. This bridge was later renamed Antietam Bridge in memory of the battle, which, after several hours of fighting, was eventually occupied. Despite heavy casualties, Lee's army held out for a whole day. However, the situation of the Confederacy was precarious. The army had already returned to the Tuolumne River and had no way back. That night, General Lee made a difficult decision to withdraw to Virginia, bringing an end to the campaign in Maryland. Antietam was a strategic victory for the Federation. Although Miller failed to pursue and destroy General Lee's retreating troops, the Confederate attack was still repelled. The recognition of the Confederacy by Europe was indefinitely postponed. Lincoln eventually achieved the victory he needed and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln declared that all slaves who were still in the rebel areas on January 1, 1863, would be free forever. This declaration was carefully crafted to avoid alienating the border states, and only applies to areas under the control of the Alliance. But its symbolic significance is immense, and transformed this war from a conflict over an alliance into a war for human freedom. People's reactions to the Emancipation Proclamation were mixed. Abolitionists praised this as a big step forward. Conservatives, however, criticized it as unconstitutional and radical. In the South, it was condemned as evidence of inciting slave rebellion and northern fanaticism. But the declaration achieved its main purpose. It boosted the morale of the North, prevented European intervention, and began to transform the war into a moral movement. The declaration also opened the door for African Americans to join the military. Since the war began, free blacks in the North had been trying to enlist, but they had been refused. Now, with the official liberation policy, the Federation has begun to seriously recruit black soldiers. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans were serving in the Federal Army and Navy, playing a crucial role in their own liberation. At the end of 1862, the results for both sides were mixed. The Union made significant progress in the West, occupying most of New Orleans, Memphis, and Tennessee. But in the East, in December, the Eastern Army suffered a devastating defeat at Fredericksburg, and Ambrose Burnside, who succeeded Milan, launched a futile frontal attack on the Confederacy's impregnable positions. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a massacre. The Union suffered more than 12,000 casualties, while the South had less than 5,000. General James Longstreet of the Confederation later wrote, "The Union Army abandoned soldiers so recklessly that I began to believe they had an unlimited supply." This battle tarnished Burnside's reputation and also dampened the morale of the TOK army, causing them to disperse in groups. As 1863 began, both sides were preparing for what they knew would be a decisive year. The Federation has the resources and manpower to win, but it needs better leadership and a clearer strategy. Although the Confederate States of the South were short of personnel and supplies, it still had excellent generals and the advantage of fighting on its own soil. The election campaign that will determine the fate of the country has already begun. The winter of 1862 to 1863 was a period when the Union was facing crisis and hardship. After the disaster at Fredericksburg, PP2AC's army was bloody and demoralized. Huddled together with Lee's Confederate forces across the winter camp on the opposite bank of the Rappahannock River. Deserters were rampant because of deserters. Abraham Lincoln was facing the darkest period of his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation has been promulgated, but its effect is not yet obvious. The Democrats achieved a major victory in the midterm elections, and their campaign platform is peace and compromise. Radical Republicans criticized Lincoln for not handling the war hard enough, while conservative Democrats accused him of turning the conflict into an abolitionist movement that would never end. The president's personal life also fell into chaos. In February 1862, his son Willie died of typhoid fever, and his wife Mary had been struggling with mental illness. Lincoln himself also showed the tension of his command. His face became more and more haggard as time went by, and more wrinkles appeared. Visitors to the White House were shocked by his appearance, describing him as someone who looked like someone carrying the weight of the world. But the greatest challenge Lincoln faced was to find a general whose tactical talent could rival that of Robert E. Lee. Ambrose Burnside is the latest in a series of failed army commanders who proved their incompetence at Fredericksburg. Joseph Hooker, who succeeded him, was a tough and braggart general known as Fighting Joe, who promised to restore the morale of the army and win a decisive victory. Hooker did indeed succeed in improving the situation of the army during the winter months. He reformed the supply system, paid military salaries to the soldiers who deserved them, and reorganized the cavalry into an effective combat force. In spring, the scale and equipment of the Chinese army were stronger than ever before, with more than 130,000 troops ready for battle at any time. Hooker's spring campaign plan was ambitious and well-conceived. He will leave 1-3rd of his troops at Fredericksburg to contain Lee's forces, while leading the rest of the troops to carry out extensive flank movements in the wilds of Pennsylvania. This will force Lee to abandon his powerful defensive positions and fight on the land chosen by Hooker. This was precisely the kind of bold and radical strategy that Lincoln had always hoped to see. The election campaign began in late April 1863. Hooker's flank troops successfully crossed the Rappahannock River and the Rapid and River and concentrated their forces near a tavern at a crossroads called Speaker City. General Lee was caught off guard and seemed to be in an impossible position, threatened by superior forces from two directions. The General Lee's response to the crisis proved why he was regarded as one of the greatest military commanders in history. He did not retreat, nor did he try to defend everywhere. Instead, he boldly decided to split his already undernumbered army. He left a small force at Fredericksburg to keep watch on the Union army, and he led the majority of the troops westward, confronting Hooker at Chancellorsville. On May 1, 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville began when Lee's vanguard troops encountered Hook's forces emerging from the wilderness. To everyone's surprise, Hook ordered his soldiers to retreat to defensive positions and hand over the initiative to Lee. Joe lost his courage at the critical moment, but Lee seized the opportunity soon. That night, Lee made a bolder decision. According to the local guide's intelligence, he learned that the Federal right wing was in the air, unprotected and vulnerable to attack. He decided to split his army again, having Stonewall Jackson led 26,000 men around the Union flank for 12 miles, while he used the remaining 17,000 men to draw Hook's attention. Jackson's flank march on May 2nd was one of the boldest actions in military history. A few hours later, his team wound its way through the thick woods of the wilderness along the blurry paths and logging roads. Union observers spotted some of the columns and reported them to Hook, but the Union commander believed that General Lee was retreating and did not attempt to intervene. Later in the afternoon, Jackson's men came out of the woods, ready to attack. The 11th Army of the Union, mainly composed of German immigrants, was completely unprepared for the upcoming war. Strike. While many soldiers were cooking dinner or playing cards, the battle cry of the Confederate states echoed through the forest, and thousands of soldiers in gray uniforms rushed out of the woods. This attack was devastating. The entire 11th Legion disintegrated in panic and rushed back from the woods in chaos. Jackson's army pursued without mercy, surrounded the Union Army's defensive line and threatened to cut off Hook's entire army. Within a few hours, General Lee seemed likely to win the most thorough victory in this war. However, at the moment when the Confederation achieved its greatest victory, tragedy struck. Jackson rode forward in the dark, scouting the positions of the Union Army, but was mistakenly killed by his own men because they mistook his troops for Union cavalry. Jackson was seriously injured. His left arm was amputated, and he died of pneumonia 8 days later. The loss of Stonewall Jackson was a devastating blow to the Confederacy. General Lee called him his right arm. His death deprived the Confederate Army of its most aggressive and capable corps commander. "I lost my right arm," Lee said upon learning of Jackson's death. "But you lost your left hand," Jackson replied, referring to his amputated limb. Although Jackson was injured, the Battle of Chancellorsville lasted for another 2 days. General Lee launched an attack on Hooker's demoralized troops while responding to the Northern Army's attack on his rear forces at Fredericksburg. This was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. General Lee successfully defeated an army twice the size of his own. After a Confederate shell hit his command post, Hook was exhausted and possibly suffered a concussion. He ordered a retreat across the Rappahannock River. The Northern Army suffered another humiliating defeat, losing more than 17,000 men, while Lee's army only had 13,000 casualties. This was General Lee's greatest victory, but he paid a huge price and lost irreplaceable officers and soldiers. The victory at Chancellorsville convinced General Lee that the time was ripe for another invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia has just defeated a much stronger Union Army and is at its peak. Morale in the North is low and the calls for peaceful negotiations are getting louder and louder. A decisive victory on the northern lands might be recognized by Europe, encouraging the peaceful and democratic people in the North, and perhaps even ending the war on the terms of the Confederate States. General Lee's second Northern invasion began in June 1863, when his army crossed the Shannon Valley and entered Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Confederate offensive caused panic in the North. Militia forces were summoned and government officials were preparing to withdraw from Washington and Harrisburg. For the first time since the Revolution, foreign troops have crossed Pennsylvania. This invasion also forced Lincoln to change his command of the army once again. Hooker was still heartbroken over his failure at Chancellorsville. He had a dispute with the War Department over the stationing of Harper's Ferry and tensed his resignation. To his surprise, Lincoln accepted his appointment and appointed General George Gordon Meade, a capable but unremarkable corps commander. He had only 3 days to command the army and pursued General Lee to Pennsylvania. This is a formidable task, As neither army knows the exact position of the other, the task becomes even more difficult. Under the leadership of Jeb Stuart, General Lee's cavalry launched a surprise attack on the Union Army and lost contact, leaving General Lee completely unaware of the Union Army's movements. On July 1, 1863, the armies met by chance in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Neither of the two commanders intended to fight there, but the collision of the vanguard troops quickly escalated into a major battle. The town is located at the intersection of several roads and holds significant strategic importance. Both sides have dispatched reinforcement troops to the scene. The first day of the battle went smoothly for the Confederate Army. They drove the Union Army past Gettysburg and into the highlands south of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. However, General Lee's men failed to suppress their superiority, allowing the Union Army to establish a solid defense position at what was later called the Fishhook Line. That night, the two armies concentrated their forces, preparing for a battle that everyone knew would be a decisive one. General Lee has 75,000 men under his command, while I have 90,000. The positions of the Federation Army were very solid and they occupied the higher ground positions. But Lee's very confident that his veteran can break through wherever he chooses. On the second day of the battle, that is July 2nd, General Lee attempted to launch an attack from both flanks of the Union Army. James Longgray's corps forces attacked the Northern Army at Whitfield's Small Dome, while Richard Dole's troops attacked the Northern Army at Sea Alps Hill and Cemetery Hill. The battle was extremely fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides, but the Union Army's defense line held out. The hero of the Little Dome campaign was Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Infantry Regiment. During the repeated attacks of the Allied forces, his regiment ran out of ammunition. Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, which repels the Allied forces, attacks and saves the left wing of the Union Army. His actions earned him a Medal of Honor, making him one of the most famous heroes in the war. The next day, General Lee's attack was close to success, but ultimately failed. The lower-ranking generals might retreat, but General Lee was convinced that launching another attack would break through the Northern Army's defense line. He thought I had weakened his central position to strengthen his flanks, so he decided to attack the center of the Union Army's position at Cemetery Ridge. On the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 3rd, large minor-scale artillery bombardment began with the aim of softening the center of the Union. Within 2 hours, 150 Confederate cannons bombarded the Union position at Cemetery Ridge, which might be the largest artillery bombardment in North American history. The artillery fire of the Northern Army responded, and the sound of the hymn could be heard from 25 miles away. When the artillery fire weakened, 15,000 Confederate infantry led by General George Pickett began to advance across the open fields towards Cemetery Ridge. This is a spectacular and terrifying scene. Soldiers in gray lined up in a long line and marched in unison towards the Federal position. Their battle flags fluttered and their officers rode horses, drawing attention. But Pickett's charge, as is known to all, was doomed to fail from the very beginning. The artillery of the Union Army was not suppressed. As the Confederate defense line advanced, they were smashed to pieces by shells and grapes. The infantry of the Northern Army, protected by stone walls and earthwork fortifications, launched a devastating barrage of fire on the advancing troops. Only a few hundred Confederate soldiers reached the Union Army's defense line and were soon defeated. The repelling of Pickett's attack marked the climax of the Confederacy. Lee's army suffered more than 28,000 casualties in the Three-in-Inner Day battle, which was a loss they could not bear. The Army of Northern Virginia could no longer be powerful enough to invade the North, nor could it win a decisive victory. The war has reached a turning point. Lee admitted taking full responsibility for the failure. He told his subordinates, "It's all my fault." He tendered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, but Davis refused to accept it. No one could command the Army of Northern Virginia. Davis knew that Lee's leadership was crucial to the cause of the Confederate States, even if it failed. Lincoln was very frustrated, that he failed to pursue and destroy General Lee's retreating army. The president believed that if I had been more proactive, the war could have ended at Gettysburg. "We've got them in our hands," Lincoln said. "As long as we reach out our hands, they will be ours." But I, like many of the Union generals before him, was content with the victory of defense and let the opportunities slip away. The Battle of Gettysburg was not the only victory the Union Army achieved in July 1863. On July 4th, General Lee began to retreat from Pennsylvania. After a 47-day siege, Ulysses Slant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union full control of the Mississippi River, divided the Confederation into two parts, and isolated Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. The siege of Vicksburg was a masterpiece of strategy and logistics. Grant had tried several ways to attack this city, which was located on a high cliff overlooking the Mississippi River and was regarded as impregnable. Finally, he led his army along the west bank of the river, passing beneath the city and approaching Vicksburg from behind, cutting off its reinforcements and supplies. The siege was a nightmare for the civilians trapped in Vicksburg. The cannons of the Confederate and Union armies bombed the city day and night, forcing the residents to live in caves dug on the slopes. Food became scarce and people had to eat mice, moles, and leather shoes. When the city finally surrendered, the defenders were starving and the civilian population was on the verge of collapse. Grant's victory at Vicksburg made him the most successful Union general and caught Lincoln's attention, making him a possible commander of all Union armies. Unlike those cautious generals who commanded in the East, Grant understood that the focus of this war was to destroy the enemy's combat capabilities, not merely to win the battle. If a decisive outcome can be achieved, he is willing to accept major casualties. The double victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the end of the Confederacy. The South lost the best chance to win the war through military victory, and the Union finally began to effectively utilize its advantageous resources. But the war was far from over. The Confederate States would continue to fight for nearly 2 years with the courage to do anything. In the summer of 1863, African Americans used their army on a large scale in battle for the first time. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was one of the earliest black regiments recruited in the North. On July 18th, they led the attack on Fort Wagner in Port Charleston. This attack failed and the regiment suffered heavy casualties, including the white Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. The courage shown by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment changed the attitude of the North towards black soldiers. Frederick Douglass believed that military service was the key for African Americans to obtain full citizenship, and the performance of the Black Army in the war proved his point. By the end of the war, black soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army and played a crucial role in their own liberation. At the end of 1863, the results of both sides were mixed. The Federation achieved decisive victories in Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but also suffered defeats in Chickamauga and Chancellorsville. The Confederacy was clearly on the defensive, but it still had a capable army and determined leaders. The war will continue, but the situation has decisively turned in favor of the Union. At the beginning of 1864, the presidential election that Lincoln faced would not only determine his own political future, but also the fate of the federal cause. If he failed, his successor might reach a peace agreement through negotiations to keep the Confederate States independent and retain slavery. Everything depends on the military operation in the coming year and whether the Federation has the ability to bring the war to a successful conclusion. At dawn in 1864, Abraham Lincoln was confronted with the greatest challenge of his presidency. This war lasted for nearly 3 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. The morale of the North is shaken. The upcoming presidential election is a potential disaster for the Republican Party and the federal cause. Lincoln knew that he needed a decisive military victory to maintain public support for the war. The president sought a general whose tactical talent could rival that of Robert E. Lee, and ultimately ended up with Ulysses S. Grant. The victor of the Battle of Vicksburg proved his understanding of modern warfare. Winning the battle alone is not enough. You must destroy the enemy's ability to continue fighting. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to general and commander of the Union Army, granting him unprecedented power to coordinate the war. Grant's strategy in 1864 was very simple. At the same time, apply pressure everywhere to prevent the Confederate States from transferring troops to deal with the threat. When William Tecumseh Sherman accompanied the U.S. Army to advance towards Richmond, he would march from Tennessee to Atlanta. Nathaniel Banks will go up the Red River in Louisiana, and Benjamin Butler will threaten Richmond from the south via the James River. This plan represents a fundamental shift in the alliance's strategy. In the past, battles were all peaceful affairs. Each army acted independently and often with different purposes. Grant understood that the greatest advantage of the Northern Army was its large number, but this advantage can only be exploited through coordinated actions. The Confederacy would be forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, depleting its limited resources to the brink of collapse. Grant's first test was in the intricate wilderness of Pennsylvania County, Virginia, where Lee had defeated Hook the previous year. The Battle of the Wilderness, which took place from May 5 to 6, 1864, was a chaotic and bloody battle fought in the thick forest, overshadowing the Union's superiority in artillery and numbers. Soldiers fought at close range and often couldn't see the enemy through the thick bushes. This battle was a tactical victory for General Lee, who caused more casualties to Grant than to himself. But Grant's reaction to failure revealed why he was different from previous Federal commanders. Grant did not cross Rappahannock as his predecessors had done, but ordered his army to continue southward, attempting to enter between General Lee and Richmond. After each encounter with General Lee, the soldiers of the Eastern Army, who were accustomed to retreating, were all astonished when they realized they were advancing. As the news of unconditional surrender spread, Grant did not give up. During the Civil War, General Lee was forced for the first time to respond to the actions of the Union Army instead of directing the development of the situation. General Lee's troops arrived in time and stopped General Grant's attack. The final battle lasted for 2 weeks. Both sides were building exquisite earthwork and engaged in the most brutal battle of the war. On May 12, at a prominent point on the Confederacy front known as Bloody Corner, the war reached its climax, with hand-to-hand combat lasting for 20 hours. The battle at Bloody Corner was extremely fierce. A T- in choke tree was cut down by a rifle. The soldiers fought with bayonets, gun stocks, and even bare-handed in the trenches filled with soil and blood. One participant described it as the most terrifying 20 hours in the history of the war. The massacre was so massive that in some places the corpses were piled up 3 layers deep. Grant's losses in the wilderness and field battles were astonishing, with over 36,000 casualties in less than 2 weeks. Newspapers in the North began to call him a butcher. Some people demanded that he step down, but Lincoln stood by his general, understanding that the pressure Grant ultimately exerted might shatter the fighting will of the Confederacy. This battle continued in the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3. Grant ordered a frontal attack on General Lee's held position. As a result, within less than an hour, the Union Army suffered 7,000 casualties. This was Grant's worst tactical failure. He later wrote that he regretted ordering the attack. But even this disaster did not stop his ultimate goal, which was to eliminate Lee's army. Unable to break through General Lee's defense line, Grant pulled out a trump card, leading his entire army across the James River and threatening Street. Nettersburg, a railway hub that supplies Richmond. Street. Petersburg fell, the capital of the Confederate States would not be able to sustain itself, and Lee's army would be forced to retreat to Bell-Hungry. This move caught General Lee off guard and he almost succeeded. But the reinforcement troops of the Southern Alliance arrived in time and saved the city. The failure to capture Petersburg immediately led to a siege that lasted for 10 months. Two armies meticulously dug a trench system stretching for miles around the city, creating a preview of the Western Front of World War I. The siege was a brand-new experience for American soldiers. They had to adapt to living in muddy trenches and constantly be threatened by snipers and artillery. While Grant was fighting Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman was commanding his own campaign in Georgia. The march towards Atlanta was an masterpiece of mobile warfare. Sherman used his superior forces to encircle the positions of the Confederate States instead of attacking them directly. General Joseph E. Johnston, who commanded the Southern Army in Georgia, carried out a clever battle retreat, but he was unable to stop Sherman's advance. Jefferson Davis was frustrated with Johnston's defensive strategy and replaced him with John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood was a combative general who lost a leg in the Battle of Thousand Moga. Hood immediately launched an offensive and carried out a series of attacks on Sherman's troops around Atlanta. But Hood's offensive coordination was poor and costly, weakening his army without achieving any strategic goals. On September 2, 1864, Sherman occupied Atlanta, which was a crucial victory for the federal cause. This city was an important industrial center and railway hub. Its fall severely dampened the morale of the Confederate States of the South. More importantly for Lincoln, this victory occurred 2 months before the presidential election, which helped ensure his re-election. The Democratic Party nominated George B. McClellan, Grant's predecessor, as the commander of the Eastern Pacific Military Command. His platform was to call for an immediate ceasefire and peace talks. Miller himself was not a pacifist candidate, but his running mates and many of his supporters were in favor of ending the war, even if it meant the independence of the Confederate States. Lincoln's re-election was by no means certain. The war lasted longer than anyone had expected, and the number of casualties was increasing every day. The previous year, a recruitment riot broke out in New York City. The voices of working miners-class Democrats against the war grew louder and louder. They detested fighting for the freedom of slaves who might compete with them for jobs. But Sherman's victory in Atlanta changed the political landscape. All of a sudden, the Federation seemed to have won the war, and voters were reluctant to change their leaders at such a critical moment. Lincoln won a decisive victory, taking over all states except 3 and securing 55% of the popular vote. This election was a referendum on the war. The American people voted to carry the war through to the end until victory. Lincoln's re-election ensured that the war would continue until the Confederation was completely defeated and slavery was abolished. In his second inaugural address delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln expressed a conciliation attitude and made it clear that he was determined to complete the work of liberating black slaves. He has no ill will towards anyone and is kind to all. He declared, "Let's keep working hard and complete the work we are doing to bandage the country's wounds. But before reconciliation comes, the Confederation must be completely defeated." After the fall of Atlanta, Sherman began to march towards the sea, with the aim of breaking the will of the South to continue fighting. Sherman's 60,000 soldiers opened up a 60-mile-wide zone of destruction in Georgia, destroying railways, factories, and anything that could have supported the Confederate war. This march was controversial. Even among the supporters of the Federation, they questioned the morality of waging war against civilians. But Sherman believes that the civilian population in the South, like the soldiers, was part of the war efforts, and undermining their morale was the key to ending the conflict. "War is hell," his famous declaration, and he was determined to let the South feel the full weight of hell. On December 21, 1864, Sherman's army arrived in Savannah and completed a 300-meter march in over a month. The city surrendered without a fight. Sherman sent a telegram to Lincoln. "I request that you present Savannah City as a Christmas gift with 150 heavy cannons and a large amount of ammunition, as well as approximately 25,000 bales of cotton." After marching towards the sea, a more destructive battle broke out in South Carolina, where the war had begun. Many of Sherman's subordinates accused South Carolina of being the chief culprit of this conflict, and their attitude towards South Carolina was particularly harsh. Columbia, the capital of this country, was burned down. Whether it was accidental or intentional remains a subject of historical debate. The destruction of South Carolina marked the beginning of the end of the Confederate States. Lee's army was trapped in the trenches around St. Petersburg, slowly starving and bleeding to death. Johnston's army in North Carolina was too weak to stop Sherman's attack. The Confederate government is preparing to withdraw from Richmond. There are rumors that the war will continue in the mountains in the form of guerrilla warfare, but Lee understood that further resistance would only bring more pain to the South. His army was left with less than 30,000 men, many of whom were barefoot and starving. The number of deserters is increasing every day because the soldiers sneak out to go home. Lee knew that his career had failed. In April 1865, the war suddenly came to an end. Grant's final offensive broke through General Lee's defense line at St. Petersburg, forcing the Confederate forces to abandon their positions and attempt to retreat westward. However, the cavalry and infantry of the Northern Army cut off General Lee's escape route. On April 9, 1865, General Lee entered to Grant at the Appomattox, that I.C. escort. The surrender ceremony was held with dignity and respect for the defeated Confederacy of the South. Grant forbade his soldiers from celebrating and told them, "The war is over. The rebels have become our compatriots again." General Lee's soldiers were allowed to keep their horses and weapons and obtain food from the federal military supplies. This was a generous peace, reflecting Lincoln's longing for reconciliation. But Lincoln did not live to see the fruits of his magnanimity. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, the president was shot dead by actor John Wells Booth while watching a play at Ford's Theater. The next morning, Lincoln passed away, becoming a martyr for the cause of union and freedom that he had advocated throughout the war. The assassination of Lincoln was a tragedy for the country, especially for the South. Lincoln tended to favor a lenient Reconstruction policy to quickly restore the union of the Southern states with minimal punishment. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's political skills and moral authority, and the Reconstruction period would be marked by pain and conflict that lasted for generations. On May 26, 1865, the last army of the Confederate States surrendered, marking the official end of the American Civil War. The cost is huge. More than 600,000 people died. Millions were injured and the entire country was destroyed. But the Federation was retained. Slavery was abolished. The United States has become a modern nation-state with a powerful federal government. This war fundamentally changed American society. The federal government has acquired powers that were unimaginable before the conflict, including the right to conscript soldiers, issue paper money and regulate the economy. The industrial capacity built up to support the war will drive the United States to rise as a world power in the coming decades. For African Americans, war brought freedom but not equality. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th and 15th Amendments will guarantee civil rights and the right to vote. However, the promise of Reconstruction was betrayed by the Compromise of 1877, which ended the federal protection of black rights in exchange for the Republican Party's control of the presidential position. The Civil War solved the problems that had plagued the country since its founding. The Union is eternal, and slavery is incompatible with the American ideals of freedom and equality. But it also raises new questions about the role of the government, the meaning of citizenship and the essence of American democracy, which will continue to challenge the country for generations to come. In the spring of 1865, the Confederate States of America was at a critical juncture of life and death, although few were willing to admit it. Richmond, the proud city of the rebellion, has turned into a besieged city, with its streets crowded with refugees, wounded soldiers and the families of desperate Confederate officials. The government that once dreamed of independence is now just struggling to survive day after day. Even when his country was collapsing beside him, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, remained arrogant. He said he would move the government to the South and continue the fighting as guerrilla warfare. But all these are the fantasies of someone who cannot accept failure. The reality is that the Confederate States, as a normally functioning country, has come to an end. Its troops are scattered, the national treasury is empty, and its people are exhausted by 4 years of devastating war. Robert T. Lee commanded the Northern Virginia Army in the trenches near Street. He knew the situation better than the president. His once powerful army has shrunk to less than 30,000 men, many of whom are barefoot, hungry and armed with outdated weapons. The number of deserters increasing every day as soldiers sneak back to their homes and farms. The Siege of St. Petersburg lasted from the winter of 1865, and both armies endured the pain of trench warfare. The Confederate defense lines stretched 37 miles around the city, which was too long for Lee's weakened troops to defend effectively. Meanwhile, Grant continued to expand his battle line westward, forcing General Lee to draw his army thinner and thinner. On March 29, 1865, Grant launched his final offensive. The Battle of the Five Crosses on April 1st crushed the right wing of the Confederations and cut off the last railway line to St. Petersburg. General Lee's position was no longer vulnerable. He ordered the withdrawal from St. Petersburg and Richmond. The fall of Richmond shook the entire South. For 4 years, the city had been a symbol of Confederate resistance, but now it has fallen into the hands of the federal government. The government building was occupied by black soldiers who had once been enslaved. Abraham Lincoln visited the fallen capital in person on April 4th, walking along the streets where Jefferson Davis once held court. General Lee's army is retreating westward from St. Petersburg and is in a critical situation. The soldiers haven't received proper food for several weeks. Many of them are too weak to march effectively. The Union cavalry led by Philip Sheridan harassed the retreating column, and Grant's infantry pursued them closely. This is a race against time. General Lee hopes to reach the mountains in western Virginia, where he can continue to fight. What Grant's troops were faster and more well-supplied. On April 6th in the Battle of Mariners Creek, the Union Army captured nearly 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including several generals. Lee's army was disintegrating, and the entire force simply laid down their weapons and surrendered. The proud army of Northern Virginia, having won many victories at an overwhelming disadvantage, was eventually defeated. On the morning of April 9, 1865, General Lee found his way blocked by Federal cavalry at the Appomattox at IC's Court. The last charge of the Confederate infantry briefly broke through the Union's defense line, but it was too late. Grant's infantry was unstoppable, and Lee's escape route was cut off. The commander of the Confederacy was faced with a terrifying choice: either surrender or watch his remaining men be slaughtered in a hopeless battle. General Lee chose to surrender. He raised a white flag to Grant's front line and demanded a meeting with him to discuss the terms. The two generals met in the living room of William Mulholland's home. 3 years ago, it was this man who fled Buren to escape the war but ended it in his new home. Ironically, observers have noted that the war began in Mulholland's backyard and ended in his front hall. Grant's terms were very generous, reflecting Lincoln's yearning for magnanimity and peace. Confederate officers could keep their personal weapons and property, while soldiers could keep their horses for spring plowing. No one will be prosecuted for treason. As long as they abide by the law, everyone can freely return home. General Lee's surrender was much more lenient than he had expected. The official surrender ceremony was held on April 12th, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Hill, was chosen to accept the surrender of the Confederations. When the Confederate forces marched past, stacked their weapons and handed over their battle flags, Chamberlain ordered his soldiers to salute their defeated enemies. This was a respectful gesture that helped initiate the healing process between the North and the South. But just as General Lee surrendered at Appomattox at IC's, a terrifying tragedy was unfolding in Washington. John Wells Booth was a renowned actor and a sympathizer of the Confederate States. He had been planning to kidnap Lincoln in exchange for Confederate prisoners. When the plan failed, Booth decided to assassinate Lincoln. He believed that assassinating Lincoln would somehow revitalize the Confederate cause of the South. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln watched the performance of Our American Cousins at Ford Theater. The president has just received the news of General Lee's surrender and is in a good mood. Earlier that day, he spoke of his reconstruction plan, emphasizing reconciliation and healing rather than punishing the defeat itself. Booth entered the presidential box in Act 3, and the laughter of the audience drowned out his gunshots. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head with one shot, then jumped onto the stage and shouted "Six to irons," which was Virginia's motto. Booth broke his leg while jumping, but he managed to escape on horseback. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house opposite the theater. The doctor examined his wound and declared that he was fatal. The bullet got stuck in his brain, and even 19th-century medicine couldn't save him. During the long night, government officials, family members and friends kept vigil, watching the president slowly die. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, becoming the first U.S. president to be assassinated. His death shocked the entire country and the world. The man who maintained the Union and liberated the slaves was knocked down at his greatest moment of victory. This assassination was part of a larger conspiracy that also included attacks on other government officials. One of Booth's accomplices, Lewis Sparwell, seriously harmed Secretary of State William C. R.D. at his home, while George at C. R. was supposed to kill Vice President Henry Johnson, but he lost his courage. The conspiracy to overthrow the federal government largely failed, but Lincoln's death was already a catastrophe. On April 26, 1865, Booth was pursued and killed by Union soldiers in a tobacco warehouse in Virginia. His accomplices were captured and tried by a military court. 4 of them were executed, including Mary Surratt, who was the first woman to be executed by the federal government. The prompt verdict reflects the public's sanguine desire for revenge. The entire North and many of the South were mourning Lincoln's death, realizing that they had lost the greatest hope of Reconstruction. The president's body was transported from Washington to Springfield, Illinois by a funeral train, with millions of Americans standing on both sides of the railway tracks to pay their respects. This was the largest funeral in American history at that time. This assassination elevated Lincoln to the rank of martyr and ensured his status as one of the greatest presidents of the United States. This man, who was once reviled by many during his lifetime, is now regarded as a great liberator who sacrificed his life for the cause of freedom. As radical Republicans controlled the Reconstruction process, his death also ensured that the Reconstruction would be more severe than he had expected. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's death, was a Democrat from Tennessee and remained loyal to the Union, but he lacked Lincoln's political skills and moral authority. His lenient policy towards the South soon led to a conflict between him and Congress. The Reconstruction period will be marked by intense political struggles that have lasted for more than a decade. On May 26, 1865, the last Confederate army surrendered in Texas, marking the official end of the war. But the process of unifying the country will take a longer time. The South was in ruins. Cities were burned down, railways were destroyed, and the economy was in a state of devastation. The Reconstruction task will require tremendous efforts and resources. The casualties caused by the war are astonishing. More than 620,000 Americans died, more than the total number of American deaths in all other wars combined. Another hundreds of thousands of people were injured and many were disabled for life. The entire family has been wiped out, and the demographic impact will last for several generations. The economic cost is equally huge. The federal government spent over $3 billion on the war, resulting in a national debt that would take decades to pay off. The economy of the South was completely destroyed, property values collapsed, and the labor system based on slavery was abolished overnight. But the war has also brought about positive changes. Slavery was permanently abolished, fulfilling the commitment in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The federal government has been strengthened and modernized with new institutions and capabilities that can serve the country well in the industrial age. The war also accelerated the technological and social changes that were already underway. The railway network has been expanded and improved. The telegraph connected the distant regions of this country, and new manufacturing technologies were also developed. Women have entered the workforce in an unprecedented number, and their contributions to the war have begun to change people's attitudes towards their abilities and rights. For African Americans, war brought freedom but not equality. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the struggle for civil rights continued for another century. The promise of Reconstruction was betrayed by the Compromise of 1877, which ended the federal protection of black rights in exchange for the Republican Party's control of the presidential position. The Civil War resolved the fundamental problems that had plagued the country since its founding. The Federation is permanent and indivisible. No state can be separated from it. Slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the United States and has been abolished forever. The federal government is above the states, and the Constitution is the highest law of the country. But this war also raised new questions about the essence of American democracy and the significance of citizenship. The expansion of federal power during the war set a precedent, providing reasons for the government to further intervene in the economy and society. The struggle for racial equality will continue for a long time even after the final shot is fired. The memory of the Civil War will shape the descendants of American politics and culture. Veterans organizations will become a powerful political force, and the Republic's army will help elect Republican presidents for decades. The myth of failure would romanticize the Confederate States and help defend the apartheid system that replaced slavery. The battlefields where many Americans sacrificed their lives will become sacred lands, preserved as national parks and monuments in memory of those who fought in sacrifice. Gettysburg, Antietam, Hilo, and dozens of other places will become pilgrimage destinations for Americans seeking to learn about their history and commemorate their ancestors. The Civil War was a decisive event in American history, transforming the United States from a loose state confederation into a modern nation. After the war, the United States became stronger, more unified, and more committed to the ideals of freedom and equality. But this experience also left scars on it, and these traumas will take several generations to heal. As the gunshots died down, the soldiers returned home, and the Americans were faced with the arduous task of rebuilding the country. Material damage can be repaired with time and effort, but psychological and emotional wounds will be more difficult to heal. The war has ended, but its legacy will be passed down from generation to generation. The American Civil War was a huge tragedy, but it was also a victory for the human spirit. At the darkest moment of the conflict, Americans demonstrated extraordinary courage, determination, and a spirit of sacrifice. They fought not only for territorial or political power, but also for their deepest beliefs in freedom, equality, and the essence of government. This war tested the democratic experiment of the United States and found it powerful enough to withstand the most severe challenges. The Federation was thus preserved. Slavery was abolished and the country was stronger and more united than ever before. This is a victory won with blood and wealth. But this victory benefits not only Americans, but also people around the world who regard the United States as a beacon of freedom and democracy. The story of the American Civil War ultimately boils down to a tale of the power of thought and the willingness of people to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. It reminds us that freedom is never free. Democracy requires constant vigilance and efforts to maintain, and the price of freedom is to always remain vigilant. The men and women who fought and sacrificed their lives amid great conflict have left us a legacy that we can never forget and a responsibility that we can never evade. Today, as we commemorate the American Civil War, we pay tribute not only to the soldiers who fought and sacrificed for it, but also to all those who defended the Union and brought the blessing of freedom to all Americans. Their sacrifices were not in vain, for they helped build a country that, despite its flaws and failures, remains a beacon of hope and freedom for the world. This war that tore the United States apart eventually made it stronger.